From the narrow labyrinths of Greek legend, to incredible adventures like the Lost Caverns of Serjankith and Vault of the Drow, to the games that we play on our own tabletops, and even legends of the tabletop scene like Hero Quest, there's one thing that all of these have in common, and that is phenomenal dungeons. Hello everybody, I am Kyle, welcome to Desks and Dorks. Two things. One, if you could give us a like, a share, a comment, subscribe, all of that stuff really does help us out immensely, and if you truly want to help us keep the lights on, you can do that by actually going into the description below and making a purchase of one of our games. With that out of the way, let's talk about making better dungeons. A few weeks ago in a community post, I actually asked, hey, what kind of content are you looking for from Desks and Dorks moving forward? We're over 1,000 subscribers by a pretty decent margin at this point, and I'd like to continue to make the content that all of you enjoy. So, made a poll in the community tab, asked the Discord, by the way, shameless self-plug, you can still join our Discord, links to that in the description below as well. And everybody resoundingly said they wanted to talk about how to make better dungeons, and so this is actually the first of a series of videos that I'm going to be doing on strictly making dungeons. So basically what's going to happen is every one of these videos, I'm going to talk about a skill for dungeon creation, I'm going to give you a preview of what we're going to talk about in the next one, and we're going to move from there. These are going to come out every 2 to 3 days, and I hope you really enjoy them. With that being said, let's talk about how to make better dungeons. So the first thing we need to discuss is that you need to have two guiding principles when you are building and creating your own dungeons that are going to interest, appeal, and even wow your players. So two guiding principles. The first one is consistency, and what I mean by that is that your dungeon must obey the rules of the game world. What does that look like? Well, for example, let's consider my favorite fantasy setting of all time, The Witcher. I love The Witcher, and while there is magic in The Witcher, it is a low-level magic, right? Magic is seen as either something that is very rare and something to be afraid of, or something that pops up only when there are really dire consequences or when the need truly arises. Again, if you're playing in a low fantasy world, then your dungeon should follow that rule set. What I mean by that is, in a low fantasy setting, your dungeon probably shouldn't have an abundance of fantasy items, and it probably shouldn't have large groups of magic users running around unless, again, there's a very good reason for that. Using consistency actually increases the buy-in that you get from your players. Again, if you want the players to engage with your world openly, honestly, and earnestly, you're going to need to have the things that you create within that world follow your own rule set. This level of consistency is not only going to make it easier for you as a game master, but it's going to reward players who engage in good faith with the kind of stuff that you create. Again, if you were doing like a high fantasy dungeon, maybe you do want a unicorn trapped underneath the ground by goblins who all have magic slingshots. That makes sense if you're playing a whimsical high fantasy version of a world. But again, whatever world you're in, however you choose to structure it, please make sure that your dungeons have consistency to them. I cannot stress this enough. The second guiding principle is realism. So does your dungeon make sense as its own contained world? Now you might be asking yourself, well, how is that different than consistency? Consistency has to deal with the overarching universe that you as the game master have created, whereas realism actually delves into the dungeon itself. So let's take, for example, this wizard's hut or wizard's tower, right? Let's assume that this wizard's tower is part of a dungeon, or perhaps maybe even this wizard's tower if you like this map a little bit better. In a wizard's tower, we have to think about the kinds of things that a player might encounter when they're delving into the lair of some arcane master. So, for example, animated objects like brooms or buckets or wands, anything that feels like Fantasia, golems, or apprentices who protect the tower would all make sense. It all fits with the realism of the dungeon that you have created. It would not make sense, for example, however, for there to be heavy religious iconography, unless that's like some sort of big, huge plot reveal, or like a horde of flesh-eating clowns. Again, you want each dungeon to feel like its own self-contained world, or to connect in some way to the overarching one that you have made, and that is why when you're building a dungeon, we need to look for realism and consistency. And to show you how we can apply some of these principles, I'm going to pass it back to me with the camera, and we are actually going to talk about a wonderful little tower. But before we get into that, the next video, we're going to talk about the three main actual creation methods for a dungeon and how you can adapt them to your own games. We'll talk about that next time, but for right now, I'm going to pass it back to camera me, and we are going to talk all about this lovely Foreboding Fortress. Thanks, Narration Me, it's Camera Me. And so I did a couple things. One, I found this cool castle. Here's how it works. I liked it. It reminded me of Felvidic and also Fear and Hunger, two of my favorite new video games. So I kept it. Two, there is no script for this part. I didn't want to script it, and I also didn't prepare anything about this except for the picture itself, because I wanted you all to understand that I am doing this with you and how easy it is, how low prep it is, because again, I don't prep any of my Dungeons and Dragons stuff or any of my RPG stuff in general, and I don't think you should either, but sometimes a little bit can help. So especially if you're new, let's talk about how we do it. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is, of course, consistency. Again, we want to talk about the game world and how that actually applies. Our game world is going to be medium fantasy. Okay, so basically your bog standard fantasy RPG, right? Wizards, town guard, all that jazz, right? We're talking like Tolkien, basically. So, what is the backstory of this place now that we've got our medium fantasy thing? So again, I'm just going to do a little quick backslash because consistency and realism. So it's a medium fantasy campaign setting. Do that first. Medium fantasy campaign setting. Lastly, a little bit of backstory. This is a ruined fortress that has been left abandoned by retreating forces of the king. Cool. So now we know that this is a ruined military installation in a medium fantasy setting. Now we can fill it with stuff. When I'm filling up a dungeon, I like to fill it up with anywhere from 3 to 6 things the players might potentially interact with. And I do this because I don't want to flesh it out too much. Players might miss it and I would lose all of that time. And also, you never really know what your players are going to be interested in until you actually do it. And so I try to not flesh out as much as I can. I just try to give myself 3 little tiny bullet points, things like that. So for example, wounded soldiers would be something that's there to find. This is a big structure, so perhaps bandits have begun using it as a hideout. You probably won't find lots of treasure, right, because a retreating army would probably have taken it with them, but you might find foodstuffs or gear left behind, right, especially heavier gear. Maybe even a functioning siege weapon is something that they had to leave behind because they just couldn't, bring it with them in time in order to get out of the fortress before they were pushed out. A couple other things that you could maybe potentially do. It does look like there's a moat, so maybe there's some sort of creature in the moat. And then last but certainly not least, I think there should be one noblewoman as a prisoner. And just like that, our dungeon is ready to go. In terms of its overarching theme and how it relates to the consistency of our world, remember we're in a medium fantasy setting, and again, into the story that we have built for this as a ruined fortress that has only been recently abandoned, right? And again, the recently abandoned thing means that I'm probably not going to include stuff like zombies, for example, or like huge growing or sentient moss or vines, because it's a recent fortress, right? It's something that was, up until the players arrived, had been well maintained and well taken care of. Again, all of the things that we're talking about sort of just dovetail nicely into one another, so to speak, and allow you to make a dungeon that's going to be a little bit more interesting and a little bit more intriguing. I will actually tell you what, so when we're doing this next time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick back up with this example using the things that we're talking about here, and I'll show you how to evolve it with those 3 different ways that you can make your own dungeons. But until next time, I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. If you feel like this has been helpful for you, a like, a share, a comment, a subscribe really does mean the world. And again, if you really want to help us keep the lights on, all of the games are in the description below. Be sure to join the Discord. We're doing a contest about dungeon making, so you can actually win some of our games for free. But until next time, I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You guys have been awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.